the talk tonight, Spielraum, is a book, a monograph that we've just put out in the last 9 months that talks about this idea, I think, of a kind of room for play, or this idea of experimental work, which is how we've set up the practice, and this relationship between the practice itself and the academic work we do, and then the idea of embedding a kind of research aspect in the practice. And a lot of that happens with students. We have lots of interns in the office, so it's sort of capturing that space to let that happen. So this is the book, which we organized with a number of essays in it, but we organized the book not so much as a chronology of projects that we did one after the other, but really as a series of work areas. Hal was the editor for the project, and he talks about this idea of bricolage, this idea of how you set up your project, and what are the things you can react to, or what drives an architectural project. So I think we like that very much, this idea that the practice can evolve, it can change, it can react to different conditions, whether they're technological conditions or conditions of site or building culture. So, which again sort of colors or differentiates the kinds of projects that we do. So one sort of work area that Eric just mentioned was this idea of fabrication research, which we set up in the practice. So is an idea of materiality, but it's also an idea of the kind of components on our buildings that many of these things we develop ourselves. We don't really work with the building catalog so much, or we can build our own kinds of work areas or materials. So, and this idea of material, I mean, it's really not like a mantra in the office, but it was at the beginning, after coming out of graduate school with Regine at about the same time, a way of setting up the practice, a series of interests or a series of concerns that helped us do that. So, so we were very interested in tools, how you can use tools. So you can use high-tech tools like this, or you can use a hammer. It really doesn't matter. It wasn't going to be like parametric design is going to take over the world or save the world. You can look at different kinds of tools and figure out how to use them, and also looking at materials. So when we came to Germany in the early 90s, a lot of our first projects were factories. We worked for industry, and we were doing factories all over southern Germany. And while we were working for these kinds of clients, we started to find out about their technologies, and became very keen on the idea of using their technologies for producing projects. So when we were at school, the diagram on the top might be this idea of starting to use software to make forms, and then thinking about materials somewhere down the line, and then how you might transform the material through tooling. So in a way, the way we'd like to work ideally in the offices is almost the opposite, where you take materials, you look at tools, software, controlling those tools often, and what kind of a spatial or formal outcome that might produce. So, so a diagram like this as a kind of, could illustrate that idea of using tools and materials to produce again, a kind of architectural outcome. At the same time, we started working, in a way, collecting partners in industry in Europe that were specific to different kinds of materials that were very keen or willing to work with us up front in terms of developing new ideas. Some of them are kind of obvious partners from the building industries. Some of them, like BMW, not outside or parallel companies that would help us do these kinds of projects. We also started making our own books, which you can do also. You probably do in the school, but we started doing these very quick, very cheap, sort of almost like manuals to collect some of these ideas as process, not so much about documenting single buildings that we were doing, but talking about processes. So before we did the monograph this year, we did a number of these for the Architectural Association in London. We catalog these things. We started making our own kinds of folios where we could collect different kinds of books and different ideas, and even sort of distribute them within the office, as well as distributing through the school, like the but also doing kinds of exhibitions, almost like a kind of natural science you know, exhibition, you know, of collecting different materials, some at different scales, some at the scale of 1 to 1, but really in a physical way, and show them again as kinds of collections. Or I think this idea of an archive, where we had this as an archive in our practice, so to use materials and ideas which you can add to, you can use these things or you can not use them, but almost again like a kind of library of different ideas. Some of these ideas had a kind of history, like we were interested in the history of space frames and how you could think about these digitally, how you could produce these kinds of projects, and again, deploy them or use them in our own architectural projects. So the tool you saw earlier, we would send students down to the factories. They would find out about the sort of economics, the speeds, the kinds of materials you could use with different materials. And in a really kind of a naive way, we would just produce these things and cut them, you know, thinking about an architectural application, but was usually a kind of process where, in this case, we produced an array of these laser cut tubes for an exhibition in Basel in Switzerland, which became ultimately an idea for a facade that could very simply and kinetically turn these tubes to produce, you know, a kind of formal, a kind of aesthetic effect, but at the same time a performative one. So by turning these tubes, these showrooms could be transparent, you could see what was inside of them, or by turning them, it could be the sun screening, the sun protection. So this idea of a kind of, I guess, sustainability, but not simply as something you tack onto the building, but really something that's integrated, essential with the architectural idea of the project. So about this time, you know, we're also working with installations, exhibitions. So architectural exhibitions really became about working to one, so we produced installations that were kind of like a product, but also about an environment we could produce with, in this case, laser cut tubes, which were scripted, so you could make one cut and produce a kind of tangent topographical project. Again, as a kind of quasi-architectural project that we could find an application for later. In this image, I think there was also an interest in historical projects and thinking about historical projects and revisiting them. In this case, Konrad Waxman, who had a strong history in Berlin in the 30s, working in timber construction. His sort of development of the space frame, in this case for hangar projects, to think about what would that project mean today. So we did a competition a few months ago for Stihl, which is a German company that makes these chainsaws. So, and they had their own forest, so they could harvest trees from their own forest and then cut them to produce these trusses, which then we could build in a kind of large exhibition showroom for their products in this forest in southern Germany, next to an existing building next to it, which we also did a new idea for the facade of it. But we really like this idea of using the tools that they produce, but then kind of producing a Konrad Waxman-like space frame project, but in a really low-tech way, where you could literally just cut these trees with a chainsaw and then pin them together with bolts and construct it, very economically and very quickly. That would produce these kinds of a very kind of neutral, almost like a hangar-like space. So, and these kinds of projects were, really close to the industrial projects that we've been doing for like the last 15 years. So again, working for these Mittelstand, or these are usually family-owned companies in southern Germany, to produce a project like this, that you could almost build it yourself. It was so simple in terms of detailing and putting it together and the processes for making it. At the same time, I mean, this idea of tessellated structures, space frames, this project is a kind of work in process, which we call thicket. These are tiny, it's a structure made out of wire, 2mm stainless steel wire that we just zip clip together. The pieces were digitally bent by a company that usually makes something like coat hangers to produce almost labyrinth-like space, which we first did in the show, How Soon Is Now, in Berlin. We taught ourselves in a courtyard of our studios how to put these together. We made these frames where you could put it. We did some calculations on the structural engineering of it. We realized the project could take a roof of kind of very simple plywood roof. You could put it on the floor, almost like a domino type of diagram as a kind of module. So we produced this in the studios as a kind of prototype or a module that you could add to. It has a certain scale. It's like 250 meter high. And then we produced it again as a one-to-one. So we produced the element, then we produced it as a kind of sandwich structure, ultimately with the idea of making kind of spaces like this, but as a kind of plug-in project where you could produce it in different arrays, so that the red part here would represent the one-to-one that we produced, but you could expand this project into different kinds of arrays. So this is a top view looking into this space. But the idea was that the structure itself would be almost completely dematerialized, kind of like a blur. So if you put this pavilion, like say in a landscape in a park, you could see through it. So the idea that vertical structure, which is usually really heavy, really physical, could be something almost almost nothing, a kind of blur-like structure that would create a kind of space. So again, these are kinds of I don't know, think tank projects. There's no really client for the kind of project like this, but we just produce these things on our own initiative. So and other projects are more collaborative with the Gina project. We had won a competition for BMW in Munich for their design center. And the project went on hold, but we kept working with Chris Bangle, who's American from Milwaukee, who's the head of design at BMW. And he had designed this really strange car, which was called Gina, which has an elastic kinetic skin. So the idea that the car could change its shape, the doors, by these kind of typical ways of doors or things opening, it would just kind of fold apart. So we thought it was an okay idea for a car, but maybe even a more interesting idea for an architecture. So last year we did in Rem Koolhaas's show on the elements of architecture in the Giardini in Venice. We did a wall. So basically, it's a kind of history of walls, from a very archaic stone wall, the brick wall, acoustical partition, a glass partition, to this kinetic wall project we did. So we flew to Rotterdam to show Rem this sort of ridiculous film that we did by simply almost like a puppet theater of how that would work. So and our interest and his interest was really how say a kinetic surface could change the space between these layered walls, which was a very narrow space that you could walk through. So so we saw it. He really liked the idea. So we produced it in Venice. So so this is Sajima kind of petting it, which is this nice. It moved, but it also had a double layer of a fabric that produced a kind of moire effect. But you can kind of see how it works spatially as a series of layers. We also it worked like this. So I mean, it was a little tongue-in-cheek, really, as an architectural idea. But we did run this as a studio at Harvard for lightweight housing, which was quite interesting, because you could have a kind of scaffolding structure. It could be metal, it could be wood, and then a skin that was activated that changed. So when we thought about this project programmatically, it was quite interesting that an idea of architecture that could get smaller or could get bigger, could add, could be compact, and again with very, in a way, relatively little information or very little material. So, but a lot of these things, I mean, we started to set them up as ways, again, as prototypes, rather than an installation. This was an installation we did a couple years ago for Carson Chan in Marrakesh. Morocco has no museum of modern art, so the idea from Carson was to bring architecture and art into the public realm. So we got this fantastic site at the mosque, the Kotobia Mosque in Marrakesh, where we could do a kind of site-specific installation there. So, so this is us back at our studios in Berlin, drawing the project and then modeling it, large-scale models, which we like to work in a lot. And it's simply, just strings and these kinds of frameworks using this idea of ruled geometry. And ruled geometry is very simple. It's just straight lines that you offset to produce complex surfaces. So, but the interesting thing was really translating this from a kind of, I guess, digital world in Berlin to very much a kind of craftsmanship world in Marrakesh. So we brought all the material to the site with donkeys in these carts up here, and then had local fabricators, make the metal connections and the wood for it, which let us do the whole project in two weeks. So Mohammed was the head of our construction team, and he had a lot of experience in terms of traditional weaving techniques, knot tying and stuff, so he was able to sort of calibrate the project, sort of tell us how long to do it, how we would do it, in a sense sort of interpreting the drawings and models that we brought on site. So we were able to produce this project, which had, again, for us as a kind of test, an interesting material effect. It was very light, how it sort of covered, how it worked in terms of shadow and the light's very intense. Sun there, it fit within this 5 meter by 5 meter grid of the site, this abandoned sort of ruined site. Had a certain effect at night in terms of light and air. So again, the idea of it as a site-specific installation, but we kept thinking about how this might translate to, say, an industrial architecture or at a different scale. So in a way, that project informed this Fellows Pavilion, which we just finished a few months ago at the American Academy in Berlin, which used this idea of a hyperbolic roof, now not in string, but in steel, for these study carrels for the fellows, the sort of scholars who come and work there, in this kind of setting. So it's very much this kind of park-like setting of old villas on the Wannsee, which is the lake very close to Berlin. The pavilion is kind of tucked over here in by the trees over on the right, and it sits in this kind of garden. Again, this kind of beautiful garden. There's a Kolbe sculpture sitting over here. But the idea was to try to translate that kind of roof or that form making into a roof like this for the pavilion, which is quite simple. It has the plan is 7 study places, and in the section this kind of insulated hyperbolic roof, and then sits kind of lightly above the ground on this platform. So, I mean, we really got into the detailing of it, where, again, the kind of glazing system, and then a series of prefabricated metal sort of cassettes that fit together and then could be insulated in a structure that we could build, quite quickly to produce these kinds of spaces, which can be very social, can be very open, or can curtain off and be private if you needed to do, more concentrated work within these kinds of spaces. It had a kind of smaller garden site against the neighbor's wall versus a much more open garden show. So these are former teachers of ours. Mark Wigley, Beatrice Comina came as the first scholars to work there. So that was kind of nice to have your former teacher critics occupying your building for the first time. That again was again had roots to some of our industrial work, but the idea to do a fairly highly experimental building for us in that scale and in that kind of context on the Wannsee. That's Beatrice modeling for us. So another work area has been this idea of facade making. So And again, in a country like Berlin, there's a lot of industry that's focused on facades, new facade making. Again, this idea of having a formal idea about a facade, but also the kind of performative, particularly with sustainability. How does it control energy? How does it control light and shadow, ventilation? So it almost became, at some point, a kind of site in a site. So, or this idea of a liminal as a kind of mediator between our projects, which usually have a very public exterior and a very private interior. So there was a number of projects coming out of the office at this time where that became the kind of defining moment in the architectural project. So, for example, the Gewandhaus in Dresden was a site for a new building for galleries and bistros and offices on the site. Dresden, as you know from history, was this beautiful Baroque sandstone city that was heavily damaged during World War II. So in researching that project, there was never any building really done on that site. It really wasn't an empty site through destruction, but had looked at a series of buildings that were proposed for the site, and then we kind of morphed them together to produce a form for the project, and then went around Dresden mapping the surfaces of the Baroque architecture that allowed us to produce an idea for a kind of series of templates that we could stack and produce as the facade of the building, which could be, in stone. It could be the same stone, or it could be glass or concrete. But the idea was to produce almost a kind of historically accurate massing, but then with this kind of striated form that could be completely opaque, or could be completely translucent or transparent, depending on the time of day or how you would look through it. So for us, and it would have a kind of depth to it also that for us was spatial. So and then also after, working in Berlin for about 20 years, at some point it was just a place to work from, and then more recently we started doing projects in Berlin, urban projects. So the Tour Total is an office tower, which is right over here. The buildings we did here, which were like the first building blocks in a new master plan for this area north of the main train station. This is the government center above. And it was Berlin. It was kind of, in a way, even though we worked there, it was a new context for us. It got a lot of attention in the press because it was going to be the new project through there. So the idea was for us to sort of think about the building in a historical way, this idea of a frame facade, a load-bearing facade. In the States, we'd call it like a Chicago frame, but at the same time, manipulate that facade formally so it had a certain dynamic, almost like a origami. It's a precast concrete, so it's load-bearing. We also have exterior sun protection screens, louvers there. The windows are operable. And it has a very good energy coefficient because there's a lot of cold surface. So again, this idea of combining a kind of formal idea for the facade with how it would actually work. So we just completed the building on the left, which is a metal facade as a curtain wall. We detached the two buildings from what the master plan was thinking about, having them attached to create a kind of pedestrian space in between, a very kind of European kind of space, I suppose, of going through there, but a way of testing different types of facades. So in the plan, you have this very kind of tight grid of columns. Again, it's load-bearing systems for pretty much like a column-free interior of the spaces for a kind of flexible office space. We created a system of T's that are interlocking, which are the 2 stories high interlocking pieces that create the facade. Again, on the left shows how they are folded. They have this kind of origami structure. And then because of our fabrication know-how, we in the upper left knew how to create more complex formwork for the concrete. And because of this sort of digital world we live now, we could produce on the lower left like up to 160 unique pieces for prefabricated concrete, because prefabrication used to be about, make the same thing over and over and over, and now you can make them very unique. So again, it's almost like a historical project that we could go back to digitally to produce a more complex facade, and also this idea of the facade having a kind of spatial depth on the outside or inside. So completely different than, say, the World Trade Center, which is just these kind of innocuous, almost glass facades, which in Europe would be considered, not a very good energy facade, not really a very contemporary way to deal with a skin. So we developed the facade, we developed tile. In the States, there's a long history of terracotta tile. We could find local producers who would make a unique tile for us for the building, so we could control different work areas be within a kind of core and shell building like this. A little bit earlier, we had a completely different tack for the TruTech building in Seoul, Korea. It was like there was no context that we could, it was like a tech park that was being built sort of literally overnight. So we'd never been to Korea. We had no idea what to react to. So in a way, in this case, the facade really began to be something to mediate whatever that context would be. So we came up with this idea of making a facade that would be like a kaleidoscope with a couple of different elements that would have a visual effect in that space. When we were in school in Boston, we were always fascinated by buildings like Perry Cobb's Hancock building next to the Trinity Church, which was this attempt to make a perfectly flat reflective glass facade, which of course is impossible. There's always a little bit of distortion in that surface. So rather than that being a deficit, we wanted to think about that as a kind of positive thing. So we started producing one-to-one mock-ups in the courtyard of our studios, and realized with a very, very flat surface you could produce a kind of amazing visual effect through this kind of faceting. So we started doing drawings, looking at different patterns, looking at the limits of glass size. The glass came from Minneapolis. The facade fabricator was in Seoul to produce a kind of unique facade for this. So we had two modules, one which was three-dimensional, which we could turn upside down to make a different one, and then a flat one, which was also more economical to produce a fairly complex facade. We made larger models in our workshop in the office to kind of figure out how the joints could work and how this thing could fit together. So it wasn't really about celebrating the joint or something like that, but really more about the visual effect of the surface. But you can see in the section drawing how flat that is. It's only like 20 centimeter deep that all of that works in. So, and we worked with collaborators with ARPS in Hong Kong. Jerry would go there and run workshops with these guys, and they could produce really complex pieces. So, CNC cutting the things and then doing the joints by hand, kind of a kind of mix of high tech and low tech technologies. Made a mock-up and then blasted it with water and rain to see if it would work, and then we were able to go into production and producing this thing. So I mean, this is really the time I think we became aware of that you could actually produce your own facade systems, your own components, test them, and then put them into production to, at the time, for us this was a very a unique idea for doing a kind of facade in a completely different building culture. Again, is a facade that wouldn't have been allowed to be done in Berlin. It would have been too expensive. It would have been, it wouldn't have been allowed through the zoning. But this idea of being able to show up and produce something really unique, but in relationship to the place that we were working. So we produced a facade. The window cleaners are insane. Which was really exciting for us, as we started to work more internationally and in different places around the world. and to look at the facade as something that could be completely reflective. It reacts to the weather or people driving by. The LED advertising across the street, it becomes transparent at night. It was stolen by Chanel a couple weeks ago. And they said that we stole that from them, but I said it was like, I mean, just look at the calendar, And so, I guess imitation is the most sincere form of flattery. And again, design certain areas, the lobbies we did, in these kind of loft-like spaces, very simple in the spaces to have this kind of like a loft or like lattice-like space through that. Another area which we called ultra-structural was, I guess, more about cell structures. We started doing working with German structural engineers and doing projects that I suppose we thought of as being more structurally, like the structural engineering was much more ambitious. And a lot of these projects use, like a history of 20th century modernism, looking at nature as a kind of source for hierarchies, which could be structural, which could be architectural. But the idea that the architectural idea and the structural idea would be one of the same ideas. So this is this industrial area, this Trump's laser company that we've been working for like the last 12 years. And then we did two special projects, which is this cantina here and a gatehouse here, which was wanting to use their technology in a much more direct way in terms of how the project would be set up. But this was a great place where we could kind of master plan, do different kinds of buildings over the years. So this project is a cantina for these German companies in this industrial camp. A cantina is kind of where everyone meets. It's like a cafeteria, and usually there are these terrible spaces which are in the basement of these companies. But we were able to think about it a little bit differently, like an event space. You could have parties there, or musical events, lectures. Factories are something they're always being built. They're like infinite cities. You're always adding on to them. So this is really like a one-off, like a Pavilion type of project. And then working with students, different models we did. Some were about like start with wood, some were about start with concrete, start with steel construction, and like see what kind of a structure that would produce. So what we did is we made an excavation, like an amphitheater. The hole on the left is a tunnel. The whole campus is connected by tunnels, and then in a way takes this structure, like a leaf-like structure, to cover the excavation to reduce this kind of flexible slot space, and then above this produces this kind of mezzanine space that defines the space. So we got the project going. We got to the Black Forest. We met these guys called Almond. They were doing digital construction, timber structure. CNC machines. We were down there with their drawings. Klaus, he's cutting everything in the computer. Set up these amazing production runs where we could cut hundreds and hundreds of pieces per piece. Can be unique. In the upper right, produce a piece of mock-up, which showed the joints, showed the finishes. We end up directly into the building. So this thing is going up with these little the whole thing up. We combined the timber construction with steel, so we could get much wider spans and also flatten the section. The roof section wouldn't have to be so deep. And then produce, again, these plans with these column groups that could be relatively open and flexible. And then by putting the building sort of partially underground, you could create this mezzanine space, which they used right away. And then a kind of programming of the cells, it produces kind of a honeycomb structure. So some of the cells could be skylights, some of them could be acoustical panels, some of them could be artificial lighting, that there was a kind of logic in terms of where daylighting could be, or again, acoustical panels, so that it had a kind of formal idea, but all of these things had a kind of functional aspect about it. So, so really, compared to this facade project, it was really about, we didn't really care about the building so much as an object, but really about creating the space. So the ground is like there, and then and we created. It was the first time we created everything. These precast stairs. We did kind of tessellated tile in the back. We created these cells through the CNC cut pieces. Again, in a way, could invent all of the building systems, including the mechanical systems, which are integrated into this thing, into a kind of flexible social space for these guys, for the workers, blue-collar workers, white-collar workers, clients, people who visit, for a kind of high-tech company in Germany, and then produce this kind of porch-like space that opened out to a garden that they did, again in a kind of industrial campus. So, we were huge fans of architects like Albert Kahn, who did all the buildings for Ford, back in the 20s and 30s. So this idea of really being able to revitalize industrial architecture in a place like southern Germany, where they still make, Germans still making lots and lots of things, products, cars and machines, machine tools, things like that. The other project that we did at the same time, also with Werner Sobeck, the structural engineer, was a gatehouse, which uses their technology to produce it. So we went back and looked at projects like, Jean Prouvé's projects in Paris, from the 50s, where he used sheet metal to produce all the systems, structural systems, furniture systems, glazing systems. And working with Werner, he wanted to do this cantilever building. So it cantilevers like 20 meters out past this kind of glass enclosure to produce a kind of information center or a gatehouse. And we knew that these guys made these kind of laser cut, these are like laser cut and welded decks. It could be a deck for a ship, or it could be a deck for a table, in a way kind of scalable elements. So we inherited these loading diagrams from Werner, and then started to build our own models, like at 1 to 50, but in a way using the same technology that we would use on the project or the building 1 to 1. So we created this kind of variable section that relates to the structural loading. Then we started again to produce a mock-up of this thing, how the gutter fits in, the detailing, welding, bolting. Brought this thing on site, shipped it on site, all prefabricated, then lifted it with these cranes on these 4 columns, and then dropped it into place. So this is the building, which it also acts like a kind of lantern or a kind of marker for the entrance. We were able to light the entire roof and to create a curtain wall glass facade for it that's entirely made out of glass. It's a double facade that we filled with tubes that also act as kind of sunscreen for the space. So again, kind of digitally cut stuff, but also guys that would come in just produce this thing by hand. So the facade was quite cool because the posts, the vertical posts, are laminated acrylic. So so in a way, either float glass or acrylic glass, it's entirely made out of glass. So the whole facade is, again, either transparent or translucent because of that, the kind of structural making of that. Then we created a kind of gasket detail at the top of the glass, because if it snows 2 meters, then the roof has to deflect, and it could deflect without destroying or crashing the relatively delicate glass facade. Another project about that time, a little bit later, and down the street from Mercedes-Benz, Daimler, was a museum for the future of mobility. So they didn't know what that was going to be, so they wanted something that was kind of flexible. The museum on the top is Ben van Berkel's historical museum for Mercedes-Benz, and then a kind of sales outlet in this landscape, surrounded by rivers, a stadium, a giant, test track for their cars. So, so we wanted, again, have a very strong structural idea for it. But we started like this, just like getting, veneer wood and getting it wet, and we made CNC cut frames and just started looping it and folding it. So It had a kind of ornamental capacity, but the idea was to translate those models into a 9 by 9 meter grid that would be the structure over that whole oval-shaped roof. So these would translate to steel. The loops would be hollow. We'd fill them with water, so that the loops could be, in a way, like a radiator. You know, it could be the heating, it could be the cooling for the space. You could have also the natural light moving through it. So again, this kind of all-in-one or multitasking idea about it. Like some of these other projects, we tested the roof idea at a different scale, at a kind of exhibition installation scale in this gallery close to our offices, with the idea of translating it at a much, much different scale, the scale of this huge oval-shaped roof, which would enclose their Museum of the Future. And then it's bracketed by two pieces. On the right is a landscape. That's where all their workshops are for fixing some of their old cars. And then on the other side, a parking lot. But this looping for us was an idea about a visual movement or mobility that could also loop and drop down to produce a series of spaces where they could have auditoriums or, so this is, like the auditorium space. For their cars, a much lower space versus more open spaces like this, where they could have displays of ideas for new ideas for mobility, and then a certain transparency of the building opening up out to the park and to the Neckar River. So for us, these were really ideas about the structure somehow determining it, or that idea of a kind of all-in-one where the architectural idea and the structural idea are so closely interrelated. The Smart Materials House, I mean, this has been an ongoing project for like the last 5 years. It started when we won a competition in Hamburg for the IBA, which is the International Building Exhibition, which has been around Germany for like 80 years, where it was an idea about affordable housing. It was an idea about experimental housing. So in Berlin, there's been many cycles of this idea. So so we started with the idea of smart materials, and we were like, well, what are smart materials? And we didn't want to get stuck, in the kind of cliche of tech materials or something like this. So, but in a way, there was a discipline in this project, which is probably maybe the purest one, where we sat down with Matthias Schuler, our energy engineer, Mike Schleich, structural engineer, and they said, let's just pick some materials and see what kind of a project would produce. So we picked infralight concrete on the left, which is self-insulated concrete. And so the aggregate is like clay or recycled foam glass. It's really light. It's like a third the weight of concrete. So if you put that piece in a bathtub, it would float. And then on the right, wood timber for the floors of the building, which is like, in this case, was 4 stories of flats. So which seemed to us kind of a weird combination of combining like wood floors with concrete. But the more we got into it, it made sense. And then because the material is self-insulated, it's like the thicker it is, the better it is, right? Because the better insulation. So we went back to our history books and looked at things like this, like the idea of poché, or material thickness having a kind of spatial idea, both from an exterior and an interior, like this Baroque detail on the right. And then, looked at some of our earlier experiments. I mean, we love things like Jefferson serpentine walls. It's like 1 brick thick. And then by making it serpentine, it's really strong. It's self-supporting. We had earlier experiments with this so-called squiggle wall thing, where you put those squiggle walls in, which makes it really stable, almost like a gigantic box beam that could then be almost column-free underneath it. And then created this element. So, and again, this idea of a kind of multitasking element, that all the kind of energy, solar absorption-y stuff, the heating, the cooling, would be embedded in a piece that for us was really sculptural and somehow spatially very specific. So that, again, rather than the kind of sustainability stuff being tacked on, it would be one and the same. And in a way, a lot of that stuff is hidden anyway in the material thickness of this thing, but it would produce a kind of prototype or an element that we could combine in different ways. Like some of these other projects, and with the students we produced these really big models out of pink foam, with a hot knife that we could produce really quickly, and then test them. They were really strong, really stable. And then to check the scale of it, for us it was important that this would be housing, so it has a kind of domestic scale. It has a scale that would relate to, say, your body. So these could be prefabricated and then combined with wooden windows. And because it's self-insulated, each floor plan could be slightly different. So if you imagined these floor plates stacked on each other, the walls could overlap like this, like a house of cards, and it would still be really stable. It wouldn't fold down, and you wouldn't have like cold bridges, all of these kind of energy problems. And the floor plans on a 9 square can be really open, like a loft, or they can be broken in. If you want little rooms and bedrooms and things like that, you could break it up and put room dividers in it. But then again, to produce a spatial condition like this, we have the very soft light filtering in through this kind of deep wall section that would produce, again, a very sculptural wall, but also one that was reversible. It would produce interior spaces, but would produce through this scalloping little pocket spaces or kind of balcony spaces on the side. And again, like a little bit like the Korean project, through one or two different types, you could turn them upside down. The inside's the same as the outside, to produce a fairly complex wall section, like it shows on the left, or in the corner detail over here. So we put this project out, we published it, we won a prize from Holcim, the Swiss concrete company, because they want to find new ways to use concrete. And that allowed us enough money to build kind of scientific prototype. So we made this in the factory. This is the aggregate, made again formwork out of our digital work, to produce a kind of prototype that we could test finishes, different ways of sandblasting it, or sanding it, testing how much loading capacity it had, what it would look like, how much it weighed, all this stuff. So in terms of setting it up. So in the meantime, there's this housing crisis in Berlin. Before it already switched to housing. Berlin used to be a shrinking city. Now it's a growing city. So there was this demand for housing, which has become even more extreme in the last 3 or 4 months, with up to 800,000 refugees coming into Germany in this year alone, which represents 1% of the whole population, with the possibility of 500,000 more the next year, 500,000 more the next year. So this idea of Merkel as Mother Teresa. And how do you? So you have this dilemma. You have lots of empty housing in East Germany, but no jobs. Lots of jobs in the West and the South, but no housing. So how do you produce housing? So a lot of housing right now is temporary. And buildings, some of our buildings are also being appropriated for temporary housing. But how do you produce economical housing in a kind of in the next few years? So one of the ideas was to take the smart materials as a point tower idea, now as a kind of extruded tower. In the Karl Marx Allee is the place we're testing it. Karl Marx Allee was like the East German showcase, where they drive the tanks and stuff up and down, and built with these kind of Plattenbau, which were the Soviet style precast fabric, prefabricated modular housing. This is Khrushchev in '57, looking at an exhibition in Moscow. I mean, and this housing is everywhere. It's in Berlin, it's in Eastern Europe, all over the place. So but we at the same time, we liked the idea of the production idea that you could use this material again, but again in a kind of up-to-date, smart way. So this is the first tower we looked as a drop-in, and we had this conversation last night at CCA, but how do you add density in a city, especially like Berlin, which is so heterogeneous? Every neighborhood is different. So we were looking at these eastern neighborhoods, which are dense but not that dense. It was quite easy to add hundreds and hundreds of units of housing in different sites, again, almost like a prototype. We could do this by dropping these things in a way where we're not disrupting existing neighborhoods, in terms of light or air, shadow, setbacks. So in a way, all of these are legitimate sites for building towers at slightly different heights. So this was, interesting sort of, up-to-date adaptation of that earlier project. Structurally, it works a little bit differently. The steel's the vertical structure. The infralight concrete now is like the fire protection. It stiffens the steel. It's the insulation. Again, kind of three things to produce a kind of housing, like the example on the left, that again would produce similar units, which would have these kind of balconies on the outside of the lofts and the inside. So, so in a way, it's like the opposite of these super thin, super tall residential high-rises in New York, where the apartments are like $100 million each. These could be really, really cheap, like 30, 40 square meters for, again, a kind of flexible loft-like space or a more partitioned space as you want it. So, and this other area I've been working at, and when we did a studio, a GSD studio in the spring on housing, and also with L'Aquitaine Facade were involved in our symposium, but this idea of reuse of buildings. So we're constantly doing reuse of buildings, sometimes our own buildings, sometimes other buildings, but this idea of makeovers, how do you transform buildings? Because usually makeover is not about restoring something to its original use or its original condition, but somehow superseding it programmatically. So this project Biosphere, which we did like 15 years ago, this was a post-military site. The Soviets built berms to protect their barracks. That was transformed into a public park. We did a pavilion for the German garden show that was like a giant sort of land art building that created this kind of greenhouse space. So this building's already gone from a kind of exhibition pavilion to a kind of attraction to the third makeover, which would be a school. So we're inserting these boxes into the space to provide classrooms and spaces on the roofs of them for the children. The building is temporarily been used for refugees. They can stay in a large sort of orangerie on the end of the building. But the idea of somehow going from this, well, in a way, keeping this condition of it as a kind of interior landscape where you're moving around on these oblique surfaces, to one where you could kind of fill it in with classrooms that could be acoustically private. The classrooms can also have a different kind of climate. They could be warmer, they also could be a little bit colder in summer, in winter, to use the old space. So it was interesting that we've been around doing this stuff long enough that we actually come back to rethink our own kinds of projects. There was a history in West Berlin where of how, again, density, how do you use existing structures, how do you add density in the building. Schlangenbader Straße was a famous example of building residential housing over the Autobahn in Berlin. This is West Berlin. Again, when it was an island city, it was isolated from the rest of the country. But this was an incredibly interesting example where you could connect neighborhoods across the Autobahn, but also generate dwellings on top of it. So we found through an invitation from the local newspaper to look at the ICC from the 70s, which was a mega structure. It was two students from Prouvé's office who produced this thing as a Congress center. It was abandoned recently, so there was an initiative to find reuses for the space. So our idea was to put housing, very simple, almost kind of a prefabricated container housing, and kind of create that space as a kind of park or an interior space that could have a roof that would control the weather. The roof could open up like a convertible to let sun and light into the space, to create, again, affordable housing in a space like this, a kind of pre-existing gigantic interior within the city, rather than simply building more and more out to the suburbs of the city, but really trying to find ways of diverse program and different uses within the city. The last group, and I think these are examples of housing also, but site-specific talks about how do you react, or how does the site somehow inform the architecture that we do. So, I mean, and this is an idea that comes from art, of course, and from land art and projects like this, but how does the site generate the project? I mean, I think in the end, there's a lot of interest in the idea, at least, or the ambition for self-generating projects. How do you generate a project rather than sort of dropping things into the world, but how does, say, conditions of site inform that? So one of our ideas for these Bauluken, these are sites that were left, sites where buildings were destroyed during World War II. There's many of these pocketing Berlin that are still available. And the idea for this is a so-called catenary infill project. So between the party walls, we would take these steel and timber tubes and then drop them into this site. So they're catenary because they work like a chain. And so by stepping that chain section structurally, it makes it stronger. And also in a way that you could produce, say, a work-live condition. So the tubes are apartments where you can live in, and the space between them is a kind of workspace. So a kind of work-live on like a 1-2, 1-2, 1-2 rhythm. So the tubes are then more cellular, and the spaces underneath them to the ground floor then could be completely free, completely column-free. And then we were looking at facades a little bit like the Venice project, where you could just drop and wrap the facade over these kinds of projects. So again, this exists as a prototype. We looked at, 10 or 12 sites where this thing could get wider or narrower, taller or shorter, but the same sort of structural logic would work for the setup of these kinds of projects. So again, this is a kind of self-initiated project without a client, but one where we could produce a kind of module at that particular scale, because it seems like this idea of density in Berlin, it can operate at that scale, it could operate at this scale. So this is an idea for a tower, which will be the highest building in Berlin. It's a hotel. It's also set up for housing as a kind of ensemble of a tower, office building, a Congress Center, replacing the old one, which we're trying to make into housing, and then a parking structure on the left. So the project will be a kind of gateway project. To the right will be like 10 kilometers away will be the new airport whenever it's finished. Yeah, long story. And on the left, the kind of fabric, the 19th century fabric of Neukölln. So the building exists between those two conditions. We had lost a tower project 3 weeks earlier to Frank Gehry in the Alexanderplatz. So in a way, this was kind of the happy ending for us of that story, in a site that was in a way not in the periphery, but also not in the center. Somehow a site that allowed us to develop a project like this. So in terms of siting it, we were relating to the existing building on the left from the 90s. We were looking for a kind of system, a geometric system of assemblage. So we looked at the game Tangram on the right, which is a children's game of triangulated forms, and then looking at extruding them to different heights to produce this project. So, which sits on next to an industrial canal, has this kind of entrance space and a series of forms which collect to produce like 1 million square feet of housing, conference areas and offices in a plan like this, which all kind of orbit around a triangle-shaped atrium, which is kind of the center of the whole complex that would produce this. So, but again, it was funny because in Berlin is a kind of city without a history of high-rise buildings like, say, Chicago has or New York has. So, so in a way, this idea of density in a city like this is really based on opportunity and limits. Where can you build? How can you build? So again, the site-specific aspect would be how that could relate to it. So we would never dream of generating a project like this in, say, Alexanderplatz, but because of the different constraints, I would say, in a site like this, you could produce a building like this on this particular site. Oh, I think that's the last slide anyway. But the idea was to simply show you a kind of, this is kind of like a compressed version of the book, the Spielraum book, which you can get at Bill Stout's, by the way, and to show kind of the work areas. So again, like I said, I mean, the practice is really evolving, it really changes, but I mean, what I wanted to do is just show you how we react to certain conditions and how those help us generate projects. Thank you so much. Nice to be here. Oh.
Well, that was incredible, Frank. Great stuff. I'm sure you guys have some questions, so I'll pass these around. Anybody?
Thank you for coming here. What's the most influential job you had prior to starting your own practice?
What's the most
Influential job?
job?
Yeah.
Oh, where I worked at?
Where you worked at?
I mean, I was really like a terrible employee, so I didn't work. I usually got fired. So I worked at Maidum. I think they're called Maidum, Letty, Stacy here, and I really liked them. I mean, they really showed me. I mean, it like never occurred to me that you would try to build things, and they you know, coming out of school, and they really showed me the discipline of construction and building. So. And at the time we were working here, it was like in the 80s, and they did Data Mart, which I thought was a really cool project. It was this kind of infrastructure project here in San Francisco. It was built, they did a curtain wall and glass block and glazing. So there was, and this was in the 80s when it was really about a kind of historicism at the time. So I thought the approach, and Bill Stout was working then, and Jim Jennings. So there was kind of these modernists operating here, and I thought that was kind of a good education. I even worked at Eschrich, Joe Eschrich's. He was a great sort of house builder here. So, but I think there was a discipline that I really liked here, and I never thought of myself as a regionalist or things, but there were certain projects here. You know, we'd go look at Sea Ranch, and I loved the Neutra project. You know, by Coit Tower. And today I went and looked at the Willis Polk, the Halide building, and I went and looked at the Crown Zellerbach, the SOM. You know, I looked at all these old, you know, some of these buildings I hadn't looked at for a long time. So there was, I was here like 5 years. So it was a kind of a good boot camp, you know, like a good training camp for me somehow. And then I went back to graduate school, and then I taught, you know, and at some point, you know, the academic, the relationship between teaching and the practice was really a nice one. You know, like we were testing ideas back and forth between, you know, real world stuff, and then the kind of the relative freedoms of the academy between those things. But I didn't come from super strong mentor world. You know, like if you work for OMA or something like this. So, But I like those guys because of the discipline of construction and learning about, and I think that probably informed the setup of the project. Again, this kind of interest in material, and I worked as a carpenter, you know, when I was younger, and wood frame construction fascinated me, and those kinds of histories. So, I mean, I grew up in Montana, where there wasn't a lot of architecture there, you know. It was a fantastic landscape, which was also a huge influence also, I think, at some point. But I mean, you know, you kind of accumulate as you go along what those influences are and how you direct them.
I really appreciate how you integrate the architecture with the materials and the structures. I'm curious, kind of just on a maybe more practical level, but like how does that happen in your practice, and how is the mechanical engineer and the structural engineer involved? I mean, obviously Sobek and Schleich are, very looking at the projects, part of the process. I'm just kind of wondering how that happens. When do they get involved?
It's like upfront. I mean, you don't call them up after you design the building and like tell them to put the stuff in or prop it up or whatever. So it's like a workshop. They'll come down, or we'll go down to Stuttgart and we'll sit in a workshop and then look at the parameters and kind of brainstorm, I guess, back and forth. So, and a lot of these guys are quite, I mean, Germany's a funny place where the engineers are often the stars, so, I mean, a lot of these guys are quite, Matthias Schuler from Transsolar, I mean, they're really creative guys. So, but I think it's always been, there's a German word called Tüftler, which is kind of tinkerer. There's this kind of willingness or ability to think, I guess, outside of the box in a way, how you could do systems differently. But it often works in workshops, and it doesn't work every time in this kind of seamless way. But I think, but I really like. And sometimes it's artists, Sometimes you work with artists, but I really like this idea of overlap, again, where the mechanical idea, the structural idea, the architectural idea are somehow much better integrated, maybe, or how you challenge some of those parameters in different ways.
Thank you very much for coming and for the lecture. It was very impressive and very inspiring too. I would be very curious that can you tell us how you are probably influenced or shaped as an American architect working abroad or working especially in Germany? I would be interested in how you changed, or how the country changed you, or how the culture changed you, being abroad for so long and being active there for so long. It would be interesting.
I don't know. I've been there so long. I mean, again, there was this kind of. I think again, because we worked the factory problem. I think because we were doing factories, I think we learned so much, from these manufacturers. So I think that and the engineering culture, those things gave us a whole, all those kinds of opportunities. I think it felt like we became more agile. When I worked here, it was kind of like suites catalogs, and it was more about products. And I don't know. It's also Germany's a weird place too, because there's no really strong camps, so they kind of leave you alone. You can kind of go to your studio and do your work. You're not like I was in New York recently or Chicago, and you're kind of in this world. The schools are really strong, and so you're kind of free to experiment and do your work and access and work with collaborators. Germany also has an amazing art scene, I think particularly in Berlin. This whole German art, photography, Olaf Eliasson, Talent Seaman. I mean, there's a lot of artists who made for great collaborations. You just kind of, that was one of the great strengths of the country, I think. So you could tap into this. So I think we kind of played to strength in terms of using that. And of course, I mean, it has this thriving economy. I mean, it's why it's so attractive to so many refugees to come there. And it was kind of a dying population, so you have this kind of, all this kind of opportunity there. But it seems like there was a kind of freedom to operate there that made it quite attractive as a place to work. When I teach, I tend to come back here, but I mean, I really like the schools in the States, and how academically here, I think I feel it's stronger. But this idea of working as an architect there is quite appealing. When I worked here, I mean, I felt like it would take 100 years. I mean, just to get your hands on something there, and also Europe. The competition system. When you could open an office when you're in your 20s, and 30s, and you could do public competitions, and you could win them. And some of the earlier projects they didn't show tonight, but we won kindergartens and things that they would support you for that. So the competition system seemed to have speed things up like maybe 10 years. So there's something accommodating about that in Europe that's kind of nice, you know, that you can get your hands on things and you can do things. And it felt very hierarchical here. Also, I would say in our office, very flat hierarchy. You know, students come in if they have, you know, digital, if they have know-how that we don't have, then they lead the project. So, I mean, that also felt a little bit different than, you know, when I worked here years ago.
Just to follow up on something you touched on, having been teaching both in Europe and in the US, and I don't know, are you getting students that are coming to your office from both Europe and the United States? And if so, what kind of contrast and distinction are you seeing in the training that is received there versus here? And any wishes or desires for?
I mean, it's kind of cliche, but maybe like the Berlin students or say the Zurich students from ETH, they tend to be, there was a joke, I was trying to get a teaching job at ETH, you know, when I first got there, and they said, you know, it's like, well, we have 300 students and maybe 3 of them are geniuses. Which meant, I thought it was really cynical, but what it meant was that they will all be competent, you know, they'll be able to design a city, a building, a room, a handrail, they would have this kind of technical proficiency, which they are. They kind of come in and they can kind of do anything technically. And what I liked about the American students, and I had former students from Milwaukee, GSD students, they're a bit, I would say they're more, in a sense, creative, you know, in terms of conceptualizing, they're stronger, I think. But technically, maybe not, you know, not as, I mean, this is a really cliche in a way to the extremes, but I thought the American schools are usually, they're a bit more agile, I think, in terms of conceptualizing a project, and the Europeans, I think traditionally, in a way, the last 30 years, maybe think more, say, typologically. If you thought of the studios Ungers did in Berlin, you know, in the 70s, or the kind of work that comes out of Zurich. In Europe, I taught, at the same token, I mean, I taught at the AA, you know, which was a kind of avant-garde school in transition to be a kind of not so avant-garde school, you know, have more relevance or touch things, whether it was, you know, industry or technology or society or cultural issues. So that was sort of the school where I started, but I don't, you know, I like teaching in the States. I mean, we had a really nice talk over at CCA last night about housing and density, some similar issues. So, and it was a really interesting conversation, and it was interesting to me to hear what they were thinking about. I mean, you know, I'd be interested to hear what you guys are working on. It's such a small group, but I'm always really curious to kind of parachute into schools and you know, take a pulse, you know, see what's going on.
Just to follow up on just something you just said there, I'm curious, having been working in housing in Berlin with the wide diversity of types, both in East and West, old and new, that's been going on there, and now having been looking around here in San Francisco, we're in the throes of a kind of a housing revolution in a way. But I'm curious to hear your impressions just over the last day or so.
Here? Well, the discussion was, it was sort of the same question that we had about generating density. How do you do it? And again, we ran that Harvard studio last spring, and we looked at 4 different sites. And again, they varied radically in terms of scale. And I hadn't worked here for such a long time. I was trying to get my head around like what would that mean here, and one of the issues we were dealing with was legislation. Like zoning, you know, like how do you, I mean, our interest in legislation is materials. How do you get new materials approved? But the other one was how, you know, like, can you add on top of buildings, or can you add next to the buildings? Like, what would that mean here? So, and it seemed like there was so many, a lot of constraints here, like, and how do you work within these constraints? But in a way, I think the constraints are what make again, this idea of wanting to have projects that are somehow self-generated or generated through a series of constraints or conditions as you find them, as found. So in a way, what I was trying to find out yesterday was, what are those conditions in a place like this, from South San Francisco, which is topographical and about building in a kind of landscape there, versus urban. Do you have these kinds of gaps or differences which could be exploited in a kind of interesting way? So obviously Berlin and San Francisco, two completely different ways, but in a way the problems seem similar. I mean, New York is operating in a kind of super high capital, radical different scale, but I was curious. I mean, if we ran that studio here, I was very curious, just thinking to myself out loud, how we would set that up. I should know by tomorrow.
Well, we'll welcome you back here anytime, Frank. Right. Thank you.
Thanks.